The biggest video game disaster of the decade. A studio once admired as the savior of gaming was nearly destroyed in just a few days. Billions of dollars disappeared from the company's value, angry fans sent death threats, and a reputation built over decades took years to recover. But to understand how everything went wrong, you first need to understand where it all began. Because CD Projekt Red was not created in a fancy office. It did not begin with investors, and it did not begin in Silicon Valley. It began in a small market in Poland, with two young men selling software. This is the story of a studio that started with almost nothing, reached the top of the gaming world, suffered one of the most famous failures in gaming history, and fought its way back. Hey, welcome to my channel and welcome to this new episode of the series Against the Odds. In this chapter, we're gonna be talking about CD Projekt Red. Let's get into it. It is 1994. The Soviet Union is gone. The Iron Curtain has fallen. Poland is changing quickly. People are excited about Western movies, music, technology, and video games. But there is a problem. Most of those products are difficult to get legally. Meet Marcin Iwiński and Michał Kicinski, two childhood friends from Warsaw. They are barely adults. Like many young people in Poland at the time, they grew up exchanging copied video games on floppy disks. Pirated software was everywhere. It was normal. Almost nobody thought twice about it. But Marcin and Michał saw an opportunity. Instead of selling illegal copies, they decided to sell legal imported games. It may sound obvious today, but at the time, it was a strange decision. Poland had very limited software copyright protection. The market was full of piracy. Legal games were more expensive and most people expected copied versions. From a business perspective, it did not seem like the smartest choice, but they believed it was the right one. And that decision slowly helped them build trust. They called their company CD Projekt. Over the next few years, the company grew quickly. They became the largest distributor of foreign video games in Poland, but they did more than simply import games. They translated them into Polish. They created attractive packaging. They sold them at prices people could afford. Players appreciated the effort, and the business succeeded. But after a while, selling other people's games was no longer enough. They wanted to create something of their own. They wanted to prove that a Polish company could make great games too, and they wanted to put Poland on the gaming map. In 1997, Marcin Iwiński discovered a fantasy book series written by a Polish author named Andrzej Sapkowski. The books told the story of Geralt of Rivia, a monster hunter, a mutant, a man who lived in a dark world full of difficult choices. The series was called The Witcher, and Marcin became fascinated by it. He believed these books could become a great video game, but convincing the author was not easy. Sapkowski was doubtful. At the time, video games were not seen as serious business, in Poland at least. But eventually, the company obtained the rights to the books. Instead of accepting a percentage of future profits, Sapkowski chose a one-time payment. Years later, after The Witcher became a global success, he would admit that he regretted that decision. In 2002, CD Projekt created a new division, CD Projekt Red. Its mission was simple: create the first major role-playing game made in Poland. There was only one problem. Almost nobody on the team had experience making video games. They had experience selling games, not creating them. And the difference became obvious very quickly. The development of The Witcher was incredibly difficult. The team made mistakes, then more mistakes, then even more mistakes. They replaced the game engine multiple times. Costs continued to grow. Deadlines came and went. At several points, the project came dangerously close to failing completely. Many companies would have given up. CD Projekt Red did not. They borrowed money, they asked friends and family for support. They worked extremely long hours, sometimes 18 hours a day, and somehow, after years of struggle, they finished the game. In 2007, The Witcher was finally released, and people loved it. Critics praised the storytelling, players loved the difficult choices. The game felt different from other fantasy RPGs. It had a unique identity, a distinctly Eastern European personality, and that made it stand out. The Witcher sold more than 1 million copies. For a brand new game from an unknown Polish studio, it felt almost impossible. It was a huge success, but an even bigger success was still ahead, because CD Projekt Red was only getting started. In 2011, CD Projekt Red released The Witcher 2. The sequel was bigger, more ambitious, more polished, and more successful. The game won more than 50 awards. It showed the world that the first Witcher had not succeeded by luck. The studio was the real deal, but success came with a cost. Inside the company, the pressure was becoming intense. Developers were expected to work extremely hard. The team's obsession with quality pushed people to their limits. Every detail mattered, every animation, every quest, every line of dialogue. The final result was impressive, but many employees paid for it with stress and exhaustion. Fans rarely saw that side of the story. They only saw the games, and they wanted more. Then came the project that would change everything. The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt. An enormous open-world RPG, much larger than anything the studio had attempted before. The game would either make CD Projekt Red famous around the world or destroy the company completely. The development process was incredibly difficult. The team struggled with the technology. They struggled with the size of the world. They struggled with the huge number of quests, characters, and systems that had to work together. Money disappeared quickly. Problems appeared every day. At one point, Marcin Iwinski believed the company might not survive. But after years of work, the game was ready. In May 2015, The Witcher 3 launched, and it exceeded almost every expectation. It became one of the most highly praised video games ever made. Players loved it. Critics loved it. Awards poured in from around the world. The game eventually sold more than 50 million copies. It won hundreds of Game of the Year awards. And suddenly, CD Projekt Red was no longer a small Polish studio. It had become one of the most respected companies in gaming. Fans trusted them completely. Investors poured money into the company. The future looked limitless. And that is exactly when the problems began. But while The Witcher 3 was becoming one of the most successful games ever made, CD Projekt Red was already thinking about the future. In fact, years earlier, back in 2012, they had announced their next project, a game called Cyberpunk 2077, a futuristic role-playing game based on the famous tabletop game Cyberpunk. The announcement created excitement immediately, and over the next 8 years, that excitement only grew. Every trailer broke viewing records. Every new detail created headlines. Every interview increased expectations. Fans believed they were watching the future of gaming. And why wouldn't they? This was the studio behind The Witcher 3. the studio that always seemed to put quality first. Whenever people asked about release dates, the company gave the same answer: it'll be ready when it's ready. Players loved hearing that. To them, it meant CD Projekt Red cared more about quality than deadlines. But behind closed doors, things were becoming increasingly difficult. Cyberpunk 2077 was far more complicated than anyone expected. The game had been in development for years, but many important systems were still unfinished. Management changes created confusion. Teams struggled to stay organized. Developers were working longer and longer hours. The pressure became intense, and then another problem arrived: the COVID-19 pandemic. Suddenly, thousands of people around the world were working from home. Communication became harder, development slowed down, and deadlines became even more difficult to meet. Inside the studio, many people knew the game was not ready. There were too many bugs, too many technical problems, too many unfinished parts, but investors wanted the game released. The holiday season was approaching. Millions of dollars had already been spent on marketing. Advertisements were everywhere. The launch date had been announced, and eventually the company's leaders made a decision. They would release the game anyway. It was a decision that would change everything. When Cyberpunk 2077 launched in December 2020, the reaction was immediate. For players using powerful PCs, the experience was generally good, but for people playing on older PlayStation and Xbox consoles, it was a disaster. The game crashed constantly. Characters disappeared. Cars flew through the air. Objects loaded too slowly. Important features did not work correctly. Videos showing bugs spread across the internet within hours. The game that was supposed to define a generation became the biggest gaming disappointment of the decade. The backlash was enormous. Players demanded refunds. Gaming websites criticized the company. Investors became angry. The company's stock price dropped dramatically. Lawsuits followed. Government agencies in Poland began asking questions, and the studio that had spent years building trust suddenly found itself at the center of a crisis. The company that seemed incapable of making mistakes had just made one of the biggest mistakes in gaming history. The year 2021 was about survival. CD Projekt Red was no longer celebrating awards. It was trying to save its reputation. The company released public apologies. It offered refunds to disappointed players. Developers worked day and night trying to repair the game. Update after update was released. Patch after patch followed. But rebuilding trust was much harder than fixing bugs. Many players felt betrayed. For years, they had believed CD Projekt Red was different from other companies. Now that trust had been broken. Marcin Iwinski became the face of that disappointment. For years, fans had seen him as one of the leaders who cared most about players. Now, he was forced to explain one of the industry's biggest failures. In a public apology video, he looked exhausted, frustrated, defeated. He openly admitted that mistakes had been made. He admitted that the console versions should not have been released in that condition. He explained that the company had focused too much on the PC version and had not paid enough attention to console performance. For many people, it was too little too late. The damage had already been done. Online discussions became increasingly negative. Journalists questioned the company's leadership. Industry experts used Cyberpunk as an example of what happens when expectations become too high. Many people believed CD Projekt Red would never recover. They thought the company would become another warning story. A studio destroyed by its own ambition. A studio that reached the top and then collapsed. And honestly, it was difficult to argue with them. because at that moment the future looked uncertain. But this is where the story changes, because CD Projekt Red had a choice. They could move on, they could abandon the game, they could focus on a new project and hope people forgot about Cyberpunk 2077, but instead they chose a different path. They stayed, and they kept working. For more than 2 years, the studio continued improving the game. Major updates were released, systems were redesigned, skills were improved, gameplay mechanics were updated. Features that players had criticized were revealed. Every update made the game a little better. Every patch fixed another problem. Slowly, players started returning, and little by little, trust began to come back. Then, in September 2022, something unexpected happened. Netflix released Cyberpunk Edge Runners, an animated series created together with the studio Trigger. Nobody knew exactly what to expect, but the result surprised everyone. The show was emotional, exciting, beautifully animated, and deeply connected to the world of cyberpunk. Viewers loved it, critics praised it, and millions of people suddenly became interested in cyberpunk again. Many viewers who had never played the game decided to try it. Others returned after months away. The number of active players increased dramatically. For the first time since launch, people were talking about Cyberpunk for positive reasons, and the momentum continued. Steam reviews improved. Players began recommending the game. Videos appeared online with titles like "Cyberpunk is finally good" or "Cyberpunk got the comeback it deserved." What had once been a symbol of failure was slowly becoming a success story. But CD Projekt Red still had one more challenge ahead. In September 2023, the studio released Phantom Liberty, a major expansion for Cyberpunk 2077. And this time, the response was completely different. Players loved it. Critics loved it. Many people called it the best content CD Projekt Red had ever created. Actor Idris Elba joined the cast. The story was emotional, focused, and memorable. The pacing felt stronger, the gameplay felt better, the world felt more alive. It was hard to believe this was the same game that had launched in 2020. The expansion sold millions of copies within months, and with that success, the redemption story was complete. Cyberpunk 2077 had achieved one of the greatest comebacks in gaming history. The company apologized, it reorganized its teams, it promised healthier working conditions, and it announced several new projects. A sequel to Cyberpunk, a remake of the original Witcher, and entirely new games still waiting to be revealed. The future no longer looked uncertain. For the first time in years, it looked bright again. In 2022, Marcin Iwinski stepped away from his role as CEO. He remained involved with the company, but no longer managed daily operations. In interviews, he has spoken openly about the Cyberpunk launch. He has said that it affected him deeply, that he still feels responsible for what happened. And perhaps that is what makes this story so interesting, right? Because CD Projekt Red is not simply a story about success, and it is not simply a story about failure. It is a story about responsibility, about mistakes, and about what happens after those mistakes. Anyone can celebrate success. Anyone can enjoy praise. But what do you do when everything falls apart? What do you do when millions of people lose trust in you? What do you do when your greatest dream becomes your biggest disappointment? CD Projekt Red answered those questions by continuing to work, by continuing to improve, by refusing to give up. From a small market stall in Poland to one of the most respected gaming studios in the world, from incredibly success to public failure, from disappointment to redemption. In just 30 years, CD Projekt Red experienced more ups and downs than many companies experienced in a century. They started with almost nothing. They fell from grace, and against every odd, they chose to get back up. That is the story of CD Projekt Red, from pirates to legends, from disaster to redemption, and a reminder that the fall is never the end, unless you stop getting up.